Hi, I'm Sonny Bailey, and in this presentation I'm going to talk about a side of autism that perhaps does not get discussed enough, and that is our sensory perception. Before I begin, I want to state that I have been diagnosed with autism since age 2 and have a lot of personal experience which I shall be happy sharing with you. I also want to make it clear that autism is experienced differently on an individual basis. So while the information I'm going to present is correct, it does not necessarily mean every autistic person relates to it, as we shall find out later. Autism spectrum disorder can be known as ASD for short, and generally applies to those who are self-diagnosed as well as professionally diagnosed. A good definition of autism is a neurodevelopmental condition experienced by individuals with brains that are wired differently, and which make the world around us different. We experience a multitude of social communication and interaction challenges, as well as sensory issues. This talk is going to focus on the latter aspect, although both of them do overlap each other. I hope that this information will be useful for parents, teachers, lecturers, professionals, and of course, other autistic people. My aim is to present this information in a clear, concise, and accessible manner. By the end of this presentation, you will have some information to take away and hopefully apply. Okay, let's begin. I'm going to start off by showing you a picture. I want you to study the picture for a few seconds. I will give you some time to think about it, and you can pause the video if you require more time as well. I'll see you in a second. So, did you see a picture of a beach? If you did, you're correct. It is of course a picture of a beach, but there is a reason I have asked you to think about this picture, as it is going to come in very useful later on in this presentation. So make sure you hold on to that picture in your mind as I continue. Welcome aboard the Autism 101 service. The final destination for this service is gestalt perception. Please pay attention to the crucial information as we depart from our station today. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the journey with us. It is time for a little bit of context as to the beach picture you just had a think about. There is substantial scientific evidence that one of the problems which many of us autistic individuals face is the difficulty or inability to differentiate between background and foreground information. Neurotypicals, on the other hand, do not have this problem and can often use their memory and life experiences to help them to perceive the information that is around them. Therefore, what the neurotypical person probably saw was just a picture of a beach, a seaside, a seashore, or however you want to call it. You saw an entire picture of it. Now you may be thinking, well, why does this matter? What exactly is the point here? Well, there are substantial differences between the ways neurotypical and autistic people perceive this information. It is now time to delve a little bit deeper into the message behind the beach picture. Neurotypicals are able to discriminate between foreground and background stimuli very easily. In other words, in that picture, they clearly could make out that there were mountains in the background, while the sand and waves looked a lot closer. Neurotypicals have usually always viewed the world from a wider and bigger picture. They perceived the picture as a beach scene, a whole entity, and probably didn't think of anything else. And for some of them, that is probably all the information that even mattered to them. In direct contrast to this, the perception of the picture is entirely different if you're an autistic individual. The information that we see on that picture is far more than just a single beach scene with a background or a foreground, if you want to even call it that. In general, autistic people struggle to filter out information that perhaps should not be seen as important to them from a neurotypical point of view, but actually is equally as important. Our brains tend to view that beach picture as thousands and thousands of small or tiny pieces without connection to the wider picture. We tend to perceive every single piece of information around us, as opposed to inventing the world, which is how some neurotypicals think of us. They do not tend to think that the beach picture is actually perceived differently by an autistic individual. And to really demonstrate this point, I now want you to have a look at the picture of the beach again, and I will break it down from there. This is the picture of the beach again, and I will warn you, this is when things start to get technical. The first thing that I generally see in the picture that perhaps a neurotypical may or may not have saw was the sky. I have interpreted this as a blue sky, and in that blue sky are some white clouds. They look like cumulus clouds, which are white puffy clouds. I can also see some dark green mountains, although the dark green may be caused by a shadow cast by the sun. Finally, a neurotypical person may have also seen the sand. It looks flat, but I see it as smooth and dry yellow sand. Those are just four of the first things I was able to see from the picture. But now we can go further. There are man-made contrails in the blue sky caused by aeroplanes. The water to the right of the picture looks dark blue, while the water touching the coast looks white. There is perhaps a lot of sea spray here. Did you notice there is also a wet, dry boundary line in the sand? To the bottom left, the sand is a different color. There is a clear distinction between wet and dry sand. You can also spot some wavy lines in the sand. So far, what I have demonstrated is information that can now be seen within the picture as slight details. But now we can go even further, because what we see now in red is the perception of other senses that would be present if an autistic individual was standing on this exact beach within a real-life situation. The sun is clearly bright, even though it is not shown. The temperature may be hot, there may be a smell of something like a seaweed, and you may feel a sea breeze blowing in your face, but you can also hear things too. That's auditory information such as bird sounds, since beaches tend to have a lot of seagulls. But wait, what can we feel on the ground? The sand is in our shoes. This information goes on and on and on until... We are sorry to announce that the Autism 101 service to Gestalt perception is delayed by approximately 10 minutes due to sensory overload impacting the autistic brain. Please listen for further announcements. We are very sorry for the delay to the service. Well, that got a bit overwhelming now, didn't it? Welcome to the world perceived by autistic individuals. It is good that this information is now available to you, and I hope it is helping. I want to ask you something. Between the first time you saw that beach photo to the photo with all the details, did the way you view that picture or understand that picture change at all? Perhaps you noted how things seemed vastly different. In that case, good. That was the aim of this mental exercise. It is important to recognize how viewing things holistically may pose as a challenge to autistic individuals, as I will explain in the next few slides. For the autistic person, there is never a background or a foreground or middle ground, but each little detail of sensory information I am going to call a unit. And in a world that is still unfriendly towards autistic people, these units are everywhere. There are literally thousands and thousands of these little inputs entering the autistic brain every single second, so much so that it is very easy to experience sensory overload. So actually, that perceived picture of a beach to a neurotypical isn't a beach at all. To an autistic person, in that particular time and space, that picture was thousands and thousands of these little sensory inputs, some of which contain very overwhelming information which is often hard to filter out, regardless if it is relevant to us or not. This is in vast contrast to how neurotypicals tend to guess what there is from their experience and memory, instead of seeing it in the way that we do. Instead of inventing the world like neurotypicals, We actually perceive it. The result is that this introduces a lot of overwhelming information that our brains cannot cope with. Difficulties may be apparent when the individual sensory units are required to be connected and integrated to form a more general understanding at a higher and more conceptual level. But additionally, it is also worth keeping in mind the following. Because, on the one hand, autistic individuals can perceive a much larger amount of information that tends to be incredibly precise and accurate, finely detailed in composition. But on the other hand, a huge amount of unselected information cannot be processed simultaneously. Let's think of an airport security desk. The stuff that goes into the tray, which are things like your cabin bag, backpack, keys, wallet, and electrical devices, all of that has to be processed one by one on one moving conveyor system. This results in a sort of paradox whereby sensory information is able to be received with huge infinite detail and holistically at the same time. Therefore, autistic people are very well aware of information that may often be missed from a neurotypical perspective. Thus, this can make holistic situations very overwhelming. We would like to thank you for travelling with the Autism 101 service and would now like to wish you a safe onward trip in Gestalt perception. Now, for some of you, that could be all the information that you may have needed, but there is always room for more, so let's talk about the so what aspect of all this. I am sure to some of you, you may be thinking, this is all well and good, but so what? What does this have to do with my autistic child, autistic friend, autistic family member, autistic student, etc.? Well, let me approach this from another angle, and I'm going to use art for this one. Bear in mind that I don't really draw myself, but the situation is still valid. You see, when it comes to drawing pictures, what an autistic child and a neurotypical child draw is often very different. Let's take a picture of a car. What the neurotypical child might start with are a couple of circles and an outline, before they then add the other details to the car, like windows, doors, and maybe some colour on that picture too. You might think, okay, well, does that mean the autistic child will approach the situation slightly or completely differently? And the answer to that question is yes. The autistic child's sense of gestalt perception may mean that they see the car as separate sensory units, and therefore they will start drawing by first focusing on a very particular detail, such as the wheel trimming on one wheel, or a door handle on one door. From there, they will add in minor details that they perceive to be on the car, such as maybe the tyre patterns, the wheel nuts, maybe the shock absorbers, and then up towards the main chassis and bumper, exhaust pipe, the boot, bonnet, the roof, windows, radio aerial, and so on and so on. All of these details are crucial. It is very easy for a neurotypical person to see a general outline of a car body with two circles and call it a car, but for an autistic person, that is just two circles and an irregular outline. The result of this approach is that the first part of the drawing may look incredibly detailed, but could appear larger relative to the rest of the car. Or the opposite, they may have started with another part of the car first, and therefore other parts look smaller. If you study pictures of drawings drawn by autistic individuals, it is often easy to see why so many of us have trouble with social communication and interaction. And to really bring that message home, it is not the human that the autistic person tends to perceive, it is a figure. And on that figure are two legs, and on those legs are feet, and on that feet are toes, and so on and so forth. This makes it very difficult to read and understand things like facial expressions and gestures as well. Okay, now that I have given you the so what explanation of gestalt perception, I now want to move on to explain the consequences, or the outcomes if you like, that gestalt perception results in. The first thing that gestalt perception can result in is various distortions when the brain is trying to process so much information. These distortions can include fragmented perception, which is when the autistic individual views things in bits, like I explained in the last slide with humans, cars, and of course the beach picture. There is also delayed processing, where for example it may take time for the brain to register sensory information, such as pain or temperature. Hyper and hyposensitivity are also very common, in which some sensory information may be too overwhelming for the brain to process all at once, or there isn't enough information at all to gauge what is going on, respectively. And this can also fluctuate on a day-to-day basis as well. But what is quite important is the next point. It is common that autistic people like myself do not react well to change, but do like routine and structure. If the slightest detail is changed, then the whole scene, i.e. the gestalt, becomes unfamiliar. For us to be able to recognize things, they must be exactly the same as we have already experienced. Only then will we know what to do with those things. This is the same for routines. If something changes even slightly, then the gestalt of the situation has changed, because we don't know what to do with this new information. The result? Fear, stress, and frustration. What may be quite interesting to some of you is that the way we perceive change can also be quite different to how you might imagine it. We actually have more trouble dealing with slight changes than with big ones, and again, this is because of gestalt perception. The encounter of new information is simply just a new gestalt, which can easily be stored. The brain just sees it as a new gestalt and processes it accordingly. But if the changes in the familiar gestalt are even just slight, it can bring confusion. On the one hand, it becomes a completely new scene, and on the other hand, in the familiar situation, we are confronted with an unfamiliar environment. And what is even more frightening for autistic people is we can even create our own gestalts. Let me explain. Suppose you could hear the voice of your neighbour on your side of the fence. She usually talks to your mum from the other side of the fence. It just happened that today the neighbour was on your side of the fence talking while not on her side. In fact, the situation has been reported by a particular autistic individual known as Tito Mukhopadhyay. Because the situation was puzzling to them, they screamed whenever they were forced to walk on the grass, because they connected that gestalt perception with the place they were in when the sensory situation occurred. And we are able to do that. We can make our own connections and create new gestalts. It can be incredibly frightening. I myself used to connect the wheels of a large tractor to a situation whereby the tractor was so close to me at nursery school that I screamed when the tractor got so close. I refuse to this day to be around tractors and will not go to farms that have tractor rides. I am now going to get a bit technical again and explain some more terms. Gestalt perception can affect the 7 different senses of our bodies. I will briefly explain each one and have a look at some examples. A person with visual gestalt often has a lot of difficulty focusing on a single detail of a visual scene, and finds it nearly impossible to separate it from the whole picture. As a result, they can see changes that occur in literally milliseconds, where neurotypicals might be oblivious to them. The flickering of fluorescent lights is a very good example of this. It makes the whole environment visually unstable. A person with auditory gestalt often has a lot of difficulty focusing on a single piece of auditory information. This is because they often hear things at exactly the same volume, which can make things like conversations very difficult if more than one person is speaking. Or perhaps you're in a social setting where different groups of people in the room are having different conversations, but you can hear them all at roughly the same volume. And doors closing, taps dripping, and other background noises are also heard at the same level as well. If a person has a vestibular gestalt, they often have great difficulty focusing on a single movement, which can make hand-eye coordination challenging. Personally, I find it very difficult to thread a needle or tie up a bin bag to throw them into a dustbin. If an autistic person has a gustatory gestalt, there is great difficulty focusing on a single taste or texture, particularly if a food or drink has a lot of different tastes to it, such as for example chili, which includes an element of spice. Then we have tactile gestalt, so things like trying to focus on temperature, pain, or physical touch. Perhaps one day you are touched in a particular place that you're comfortable with, then the next day you might accidentally be touched somewhere else, and as a result the situation changes. You feel incredibly confused and uncomfortable. Proprioceptive gestalt is trouble like hunger, thirst, and other bodily feelings. I now have an alarm on my phone to remind me to drink water because of the fact my brain does not register strong proprioceptive inputs about my thirst or hydration levels. Finally, olfactory gestalt refers to smells, so things like bad odors or other scents like petrol or perfume. Maybe someone put lavender in your laundry one day, and then the next day they put something else in because the lavender wasn't around at the supermarket. That's an unfamiliar situation. I hope it is a bit more clear now how gestalt perception affects the senses. And finally, we have arrived at the last aspect of gestalt perception that I want to outline in this presentation, and that is the importance of sameness and predictability. Simply put, on the conceptual level, gestalt perception leads to rigidity of thinking and a lack of generalization. We can perform in the exact same situation with exactly the same prompts, but then fail to apply the skill if anything in the environment has been slightly changed. An autistic child may perform a particular task if, for example, someone has touched them on the shoulder beforehand, and then they will fail to perform the same task if that first prompt hasn't even been given. If something is not the same, it changes the whole gestalt of the situation, and we as an autistic um, group do not know what we are expected to do, which causes confusion, frustration, and a lot of anxiety. Therefore, to feel safe, we create gestalt behaviors. These are rituals, routines, and stims. There are a multitude of different types of stims, and each one is individual, so one autistic person may have a particular stim routine or ritual that another does not. In a ritual, it is common for an autistic person to engage in behaviors that a neurotypical may find unusual, such as, for example, perimeter hugging an entire room, tapping a certain number of times on the table, and then perhaps moving upstairs to do a second ritual before getting into bed. It was common for me to pace up and down the family house before I slept, as this gave me a sense of agency and safety. And while neurotypicals may not see this behavior as necessary, for us, this is one act of meaningful experience, and if any part of it at all is missing, the whole thing becomes unfamiliar and frightening, and therefore the autistic person has to start right from the beginning of the ritual or routine again. In short, these are our safety belts in a roller coaster that we have no real control of. A quick summary slide for you now. So to start with, our world is made up of thousands of these sensory inputs, which I call units of sensory information. It is often harder to see everything from a wider picture, as all this information at once is overwhelming. It is far better to process information in small units one at a time before, which is why so many of us need time to process a new situation that we encounter. Slight changes in any of the information we perceive can lead to unpredictability, which can then cause stress, anxiety, frustration, and confusion. Therefore, we adopt routines, rituals, and repetitive stimming behaviors which bring comfort and safety to us, and it is important that these behaviors are validated by neurotypicals as well as parents, teachers, and professionals. I want to end this presentation with a picture of the beach again. With all the information that I have just given from the presentation, hopefully it is now clear to see how every single part of that picture needs to be processed by an autistic brain, and that all of it together could be quite overwhelming, especially if not given the time and space. This is the take-home message for you. Time and space is important for processing information because of gestalt perception. Thank you for listening to my talk. Remember that if you're an autistic person, you are valid, and your voice deserves to be heard just like mine. If you are a neurotypical, my hope is that you now have something to take away with you and remember, especially if you currently support any friends or family who are autistic. Once again, thank you for listening and have a good day.